welcome to the Mad Ones and happy Easter. If I'm allowed to say that, I'm your favorite AI artist known for such great things as making all of the president's babies and supervillains, host Cam Harless. And joining me tonight as co-host is the incredibly kind and gracious Naomi Wright. How are you doing today?
I'm great, and I'm so happy to be here. I'm excited for this episode.
Living the dream.
Yes. Fun way to spend a Thursday night.
Oh yeah, for sure. Well, and we are early tonight, so I don't know if everyone got the memo. So we'll see how many people show up live, but that's fine. It's okay. But for people listening in the future, I just want to let you know that this show is 100% brought to you by fans and patrons. So hit like, subscribe, share the show with your friends. There are all sorts of topics that we've covered. Recently we actually talked to Gary Plauché. Not Gary Plauché, Jody Plauché, the son of Gary Plauché, who is the man who shot his son's abuser on video in an airport. I don't know if you ever heard that story, but that's definitely an episode I think that's worth watching. Crazy. So we've covered a lot of topics. So share them with someone who might gain something from those episodes. Also, if you join Patreon, you'll get the occasional early episode. You'll get this episode. There's going to be an extended portion at the end that you're going to get called Last Call, and you'll get my eternal gratitude. So hit up patreon.com/themadOnes. And also, if you want to grab a shirt, a mug, a poster of the presidents as babies, you can go to wearethemadOnes.com/store and get it there. But let's get to the actual show portion instead of just me talking about things you can do for me. I'm here to give, not to take. So joining us tonight is the bane of bad arguments, the slayer of unsighted sources, the annihilator of inadequate ideas, and an apologist making his name on TikTok. He's the great fear of those who tout the old heresies. Please welcome to the show, Mr. Michael Jones, a.k.a. Inspiring Philosophy.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
You know what? I was just so sure, Mike, that I was going to come on this screen and you were going to be sitting there with bunny ears on your head because last time you had the Santa hat ready. And so I was like, I can't let him do that and me not do it. And so I bought some bunny ears and now I look like a fool.
I didn't even think to me. Like, it didn't even occur. I don't know. No.
But hey, I did the sight gag and I'm done with it now. So no, we spoke to you last when I say we, I mean me, because you haven't met Naomi before. This is Naomi. She was on my show several weeks ago. She spoke to me about her dad was actually a cult leader, a polygamous cult leader, and she got out of that, and we had a conversation about that life. And now she works helping people out of spiritual abuse situations, and so she's going to come back, and we're going to talk all about that soon. But every time I've tried to get on the show with her, there's always been at least one delay of game where we have to come back and try again. But I'm happy she's here today. She was like, I want to meet Inspiring Mike. That's what she told me.
I do, yeah. Mike. You're on my bucket list to have a conversation with.
I'm sorry to hear that. You could do better, is what I'm saying.
You're like, it's a sad bucket list. No, it's not. Your videos have been so incredibly helpful. The work you do is so helpful. And the reason why you do it really matters to me, because as you might imagine, coming from a cult, we did not celebrate things like Easter. So,
and polygamy is also harmful. I have a few meta-analysis I found that came out and showing the damaging effects of polygamy on women and the children involved. It's just horrible.
Oh, for sure.
Do you have content out on that? Is that what you're saying? Or are you
but I did actually some TikTok videos where I was replying to a Muslim back in like January, and I was going over the data in the meta-analyses, and he's trying to argue that polygamy is okay because their religion says it's okay, so they have to defend it regardless of what the science shows. So I was just pointing out, look, the studies all show this ruins women's mental health. It ruins the children who are involved. This is just not good. And they're like, yeah, but like science is only one way to look at it. I mean, I'm like, wow, this is so bad.
Biblical doesn't support it either. So, I mean, they're hung no matter which direction they go, really.
So what's funny about that, though, is I think the first video I saw you do on that on TikTok was replying to a girl who was saying something like, if your man is honest with you, he wants multiple wives. And I saw that one independently, and I replied, no, I'd rather die, essentially, making a joke. And then I posted it and I scrolled and then I saw your like intelligent response and I'm like, why do I exist?
No, it's fine. Sometimes it goes just to poke fun at it. It's helpful. But yeah, same kind of stuff. I was blown away by her saying that, and it's just ridiculous. I mean, the people think they want men think they want multiple women, but then when you men that are actually involved, there's a lot of drama there. There's a lot of jealousy. It comes with all sorts of baggage that humans are just not meant for. We're a pair bonding species.
Yeah.
That's just the truth of it.
But what was cool about when Naomi said that she wanted to talk to you, I was like, but you grew up in one of those cults that doesn't like Easter or Christmas. So you're actually kind of the perfect person to come on and talk to Mike with, because you probably heard those directly. But I thought, hey, let's bust some myths, because every time I hear one of these things, like, just because I've studied some, I mentioned this before in the last time we talked about Christmas, just because I've studied some of the Sumerian myths, Babylonian myths and stuff, like when they start talking, I start going, this isn't even right. Like your mythology's even off. And thanks, Alexander Hislop. You're great. But I figured let's start off, because Naomi's been in it. Let's talk about what you were born into and what your parents told you about Easter, and then we'll start talking about the different myths, the different bad arguments from there. I think that's probably a good place to start.
Sure. So, I mean, nothing that's going to be new to hear, other than, to be honest, you guys, Easter wasn't really backed, even with the bad arguments, which I don't know, maybe you can give my group more credit for that. They didn't even bother trying to make stuff up. Now, Christmas, they did. I know that's not our focus for today, but I'll just give a nod to that. Christmas, like we had articles that we had to read, and there's way more attacked of a holiday. But so Christmas was way more attacked. Easter, yeah, it was just, we didn't really celebrate holidays, period. So, I mean, birthdays weren't a thing. The only thing we celebrated was Thanksgiving, and I make a joke that it's just because my dad liked to eat. I'm like, it was good food, so that was why. But yeah, so we didn't really do anything. So at least it was consistent. But absolutely, heard the word pagan. It's pagan, and it was very much. I knew it even at the time, even as a kid. This is a distinctive for us. Like, it makes us different. It's setting us apart. And I think that was then connected to like the Israelites in the Old Testament. Like, we're doing things different than the culture. But the problem was we were trying to do stuff different than the Christian culture versus being a part of the Christian culture. But that's that elitism that comes in oftentimes, of course, in groups like this, or always in groups like this. So as far as Easter goes itself, they definitely hit on, bunnies and eggs. They're sort of like the low-hanging fruit to just say, well, obviously this isn't of God. Obviously this is ridiculous. This is just, people trying to sell stuff. It's just the marketing. And so why would we get involved? It's not really about Christ. And just totally miss that. Well, yeah, but it could be, just have these extra elements. But when oftentimes in these fundamental groups, there isn't a whole lot of room for fun. I don't know why fun is even in that word. It should probably make up a new word. It's not a whole lot of
the
fun
reason why it's actually in the word is because fundamental means no fun, too much damn, and no mental.
There you go.
That
sums it up. Yeah, that sums it up. And so that applies. Yeah. So I would say that all of those cultural aspects of it were used as ammo, but I was never told that they were like the sole reason. It was just evidence that it was bad.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that comes up a lot when you get into these conversations, we'll get into like the Babylonian mythology of it maybe in a little bit, but I think the first thing that a lot of people say is, obviously Easter bunnies are not Christian and they're bad, and you shouldn't do anything with Easter bunnies because it's about a fertility rite. It's a fertility god. Don't you see? Bunnies reproduce like crazy. And obviously this means that it's a fertility god. And you don't really want to support a fertility god in your house, right?
Seems like my group should have been into that.
Do what?
It seems like my polygamous group should have been into that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So how do you respond to the bunny argument, Mike?
Well, on the surface, I get it. It does kind of seem like there's some connection there. Bunnies reproduce a lot. There's that old saying. So, maybe it came from a fertility rite, because there's nothing about the bunny or the rabbit being associated with Jesus or his resurrection in the Bible. Where did it come from? Well, we know pagans like animals. They had fertility rituals. Maybe that's where it came from. So on the surface, I guess it sounds plausible. But when you look into the history, it's just crap. The Easter bunny is really not even associated with Easter until the past few hundred years. Prior to that, there was the Easter hare in Germany. And that's a little bit of a different animal because they're seen less. They reproduce a little less. They don't have the same connotations necessarily. Some have tried to argue that the Easter bunny comes from Mary because it's associated with her virginity. Some people note that rabbits can get pregnant when they're already like really fast after they've produced a litter. So people thought maybe, they had some sort of virgin conception. So in the 1500s, you can see depictions of Mary with rabbits, for example. And some say, well, maybe that's where the Easter rabbit comes from. There's really no direct connection there because, Easter is about the resurrection of Jesus, not about the conception or the birth of Jesus. So it's not really that important. And what we actually see when I can look into what historians say, so in the Dictionary of English Folklore, for example, or Weiser's book, the Easter book, for example, they note that basically in Germany, around the 1500s, people just would see animals out in the fields during springtime when they're celebrating the Pascha or Easter. So we have references to like Easter foxes, Easter ravens, Easter butterflies, and also Easter hares. They would see them in the fields in this season, basically boxing for mates. And then you don't really see Easter hares or hares generally that much throughout the rest of the year. They only sort of come out very prominently in the springtime, and then they go back away because, again, they're not like rabbits. They're more of a solitude creature. So that's generally where it comes from. And then when the Easter hare was taken to America, well, bunnies are cuter and they're better at selling chocolate, I guess. It just sort of morphed into the Easter bunny, but originally it was the Easter hare in northern Germany region in the 1500s. And that's it. That's where it goes back to. I know that's a little bit more boring than it comes from this pagan fertility ritual, but that's what the records show. We don't have, if you can look up things like this book here, like the Dictionary of English Folklore, that's generally what they say. It doesn't come from anything fertility. It's just that people would see hares around Easter and they started associating with the holiday. Sort of like how we in America started associating turkeys with Thanksgiving. It just happened that way.
Yeah, because Benjamin Franklin loved those turkeys.
Yeah.
So the other little bit, kind of silly bit, I think, is the egg, because people will say, hey, you go on egg hunts. Rabbits don't lay eggs. So obviously this is a pagan myth. And what you're doing is, pagans would obviously use eggs in their, I guess, fertility rituals as well, whatever you want to call it. Their pagan rituals. Eggs, Easter eggs. I guess they're dyeing them too. I'm not really sure if they were dyeing these eggs according to these people or not. But Easter eggs, very simple, fun thing to do with your kids that has very little to do with anything but spring and looking on its face. But did you go on Easter egg hunts in any way, Naomi, before a certain point, or like did you sneak in an Easter egg hunt when you were a kid somehow?
No, I was too busy trying to change into pants in the bathroom at school, so like Easter eggs didn't make the cut for me. But the first time I actually participated in an Easter egg hunt was, I think I was like 26. And I was with a friend and we're like hiding eggs for her son at the time. Yeah. So no.
Did you feel
no
so convicted? And did you feel evil?
No, I had a blast. But I was 26. I was out of a cult. I was pretending I was like pooping them out on the ground and like all kind of ridiculousness. So yeah, it was just, it was a weird time. But so I was just having fun with it and being ridiculous. It didn't have any connection to my worldview. It was just fun.
That's good. That means you got healthy, which is great.
But I have wondered
got some
why
health up in
we
your
do,
system.
use eggs? Like I've, so that's something
And
that maybe people are curious about. Yeah.
For sure, I want to get Mike's answer, but I also have a little anecdote that I want to share as well. Easter eggs, are they pagan?
Once again, no, they're not. They're not pagan. Again, eggs have been used as a fertility symbol in various cultures around the world. That's just a fact because it's an egg. But the Easter egg does not descend from any fertility symbol. The first mention of any Easter egg comes from the year 1290 in England, when King Edward I paid for 450 eggs to be colored and covered in golden leaf. That's the first reference. They probably predate that, obviously, because it just sort of it talks about it as if it's a custom that's happening. And the most likely origin, what historians will tell you, is that it comes from Lent. So in Catholic faith, basically, you have Lent leading up to Easter, and you fast. In the Middle Ages, you wouldn't eat any animal products. So no meat, no cheese, butter, cream, no eggs, no milk, none of that. A lot of that stuff can't keep for a while, but what could keep was eggs. If you hard boil them, they can keep. So like the few weeks leading up to Easter, they would take the eggs, collect them, hard boil them, save them for the Easter feast. And they started decorating them as well because it's a festival. So, they dyed them red at times. They dyed them gold, as we can see. And that's generally where it comes from. They're just a Lent custom. You can't eat animal products during Lent. And then by the time Lent is over, got an abundance of eggs. So that's how it became associated with it. So it's entirely Christian tradition and origin.
Well, what's interesting about that, my anecdote, is I had a friend a couple of years ago. She became Christian. She dove right into the Eastern Orthodox Church, and so she had her first Pascha, and it was last year. And she texted me, and she was like, "Hey, you didn't tell me about the red eggs," and I was like, I don't know anything about the red eggs. I mean, we do like multicolors, and she was like, you didn't tell me about the egg. And she was like, and she told me that, Eastern Orthodox, they do the hardcore Lent fasting like the Catholics used to. Mm-hmm. And since they can't eat eggs during Lent, that is one of the continued traditions, is they hard boil an egg, they dye it red, the red symbolizing the blood of Christ. And apparently, I don't know if she said this or it was another Orthodox person I talked to, that's where they actually did the Easter egg hunts with those hard-boiled eggs. And so I'm like, how much of this is all just a Christian tradition? Period.
I mean, yeah. I mean, the first Easter egg hunts, we think basically happened in the 1600s in Germany, where again, they would just hide the eggs for the children to find, because again, it's a celebration. And here's what a lot of people don't understand today is sometimes people could just come up with customs on their own. It doesn't need to go back to sort of pagan thing. Mm-hmm. Like, look at Elf on the Shelf, now associated with Christmas. I didn't do that in the 90s when I was a kid. It's very new. It just sort of came about.
Krampus on the shelf?
No, that'd be creepy. But no, it's a fairly new custom that just came about. Sort of like Easter egg hunts. They just seem to just happen in Europe in the Middle Ages. Why not? People are doing fun things on Easter to celebrate the holiday. So why not hide the eggs for the kids to find? I mean, people can come up with customs on their own. So why can't that just be it? No, it's got to go back to some weird pagan ritual, apparently. But again, there's no evidence of that.
And that's the thing that keeps throwing me. I mean, you mentioned the elitism, Naomi, of the group that you were in, the wanting to be holy and sanctified and other in some way. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know why people want so badly for every single thing on the planet to be pagan. I mean, you could make the argument that everything is, or that nothing is, because of Jesus. Or, I mean, it doesn't make any sense to say anything but all has been redeemed. I mean, let's be real when it comes to to Jesus. But I don't get it. Like, does it just make them feel like they're better? Do they make them feel elite?
Well, and I think also people who then follow along with it, and a lot of the people that we have contact with through the work we do at Be Emboldened, they're following along with it then because they're scared. I mean, I have clients that have been out for years and they're still afraid to celebrate the holidays because the leadership, I mean, it's so fear-based, right? I mean, that's why people go along with it. And so some, yes, they join in that like prideful elitism and we're better than everybody else and things like that. And some people go along with it because they're afraid they're going to be damned to hell if they don't.
That's so crazy. Hiding Easter eggs can damn you to hell.
It's this weird idea that we get in some Christian circles that God hates everything a pagan does. So people go, okay, well, if this comes from paganism, then God hates it. And there's just no precedence for that in the Bible. And I point out people like places like Acts 17, where Paul quotes a pagan poet, Aratus, about, in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. And Paul takes this pagan work and applies it to the God of Israel. Okay, well, clearly when Aratus wrote that, he wasn't thinking of Yahweh. He was thinking of his stoic pantheistic god Zeus. Paul took that and said, no, we're just going to claim this. This is now about the God of Israel. So therefore, God doesn't hate everything that is pagan. Okay, 1 Corinthians 8, just because meat may have been sacrificed to an idol, that doesn't mean you can't enjoy it. Okay, it doesn't really harm you in any way. Okay, something that was used to honor a pagan is not going to hurt you, and doesn't upset God. But what people do is they go to places like Deuteronomy, where it says, God hates every abominable thing the pagans do, and they go, oh, okay, anything a pagan's ever done, God hates it. And it's like, no, he says he hates every abominable thing they do, like child sacrifice. That doesn't mean God hates building temples, because the Jews built a temple to their God, and pagans build temples to their gods. That doesn't mean God hates building temples just because pagans did it. So people don't really think beyond that. They just go, if it's pagan, God must hate it. And that opens a floodgate of just really bad conclusions you'd have to arrive at. It makes scripture look inconsistent, and it's just not even in scripture. But that's where I think it comes from.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if I can jump in.
Oh, go ahead.
Cam, I was just going to say, it tends to then go even deeper for people. Mike, you've probably heard this or seen this, but then it translates from, okay, God hates anything that's pagan. Well, if I'm doing something even by accident that's pagan, all of a sudden now it's God hates me, the person. And then people are trying to earn God's love. And so we just get in this really bad cycle that's not at all the gospel. Thanks, Cam. Let me jump in on that.
Yeah, no, you get that for sure. And people forget that God doesn't hate fun. I mean, just go to the Gospel of John. Jesus is at the wedding in Cana, and what does he do? Does he give a sermon? No, he makes more wine so they can get drunk. Like, let's be honest about what's going on. Jesus is fully aware that sometimes people are allowed to enjoy living. It's not always about rituals and worship. There are other ways to worship God through human flourishing itself, just living the life we were meant to live and enjoying the emotions we were created to enjoy. So we need to keep that in mind. It's not always about the strict religious activity. We're allowed to do things that are fun. So what's wrong with Easter egg hunts for children?
Right. Right. One of the things that you mentioned was that Paul quoted a Greek poet. And one of the things that sticks out to me is I've spoken to a lot of Christians over my life who will just reject certain things simply because they're not Christian. So it's like I can't think of a good song to mention, but like, let's say there's a song that's very worshipful in nature, and you can worship God to this song that's not written by a Christian. It's not written as a worship song. Like, is it wrong to worship God to that song? Like, obviously not. But one of the things that I really kind of accepted, not to say that I would accept anything that someone says is true, but all truth is God's truth. Everything that is said that is true has to agree with God. And so it's like, why are we afraid of finding truth everywhere we can find it?
Yeah, and that was taught by early church fathers like St. Augustine, for example. This was not something that was anti-Christian until you get fundamentalists show up.
I think we're going to rename them Boredomentalists.
Yeah.
See if we can get it to catch.
Before we get too far into the Babylonian myths and stuff, and I'd love to maybe see if there's anything else that Alexander Hislop or that guy that did the Christmas Torah observant video, who I can't remember the name of anymore, Jim
Staley, yeah.
Yeah. But is there anything on the lighter side of things that people will point out to Easter as pagan or something we shouldn't do? I know one of the big arguments that I hear a lot is that we shouldn't be doing any celebrations or holidays that weren't explicitly commanded in the Bible. And then they tell you that you should do Hanukkah.
Exactly. Yeah, it's total special pleading. And so, yeah, that's utter nonsense as well. There's nothing, and I always push back on them. I say, where in the Bible does it say we can't have other holidays? Like, honestly, where does it say that? It doesn't anywhere. Yeah. So it's they're quote mining the Bible, obviously, and they're cherry picking and they're making up rules that are not in the Bible. So it's just absurd nonsense. But with the one thing I would say people often bring up is the name Easter itself. And they'll say, well, this comes from this Germanic goddess, Ostra or Eostre. And they'll say, well, it came from her, for example. So how can you deny that it's pagan? Well, this really just shows limited reasoning because it's only called Easter in English-speaking regions. Everywhere else in the world, it's called Pascha or a derivation of that because it derives from the Passover. So if you go to like Italy, Greece, Spain, they don't call it Easter there. They call it Pascha. Everywhere else, other than in English-speaking world, do they call it Pascha? Well, why do we call it Easter? Well, St. Bede tells us in the Reckoning of Time. He says, eostre month has a name for which is now translated Paschal month, and which was once called after a goddess of theirs named Eostre, in which honors feasts were celebrated in that month. Now they designate that Paschal season by her name, calling the joys of the new rite by the time-honored name of the old inheritance, of the old observance. So right then we're told is that there was a month that was around April called eostre month, and people basically started calling Easter after the month it fell in, Easter, sort of like how we call Independence Day 4th of July. Just because we call it 4th of July does not mean it descends from a holiday honoring Julius Caesar. It's just associated with the time of the year. So that's kind of the same thing here. Eostre gave the name of the month to eostre month, and then the name of the holiday in English derived from the month. So if there's any connection, it's very indirect because it doesn't come from any sort of festival honoring Eostre. We don't have any evidence that of that sort of connection. Christians were celebrating the Pascha, or what we call Easter, long before they encountered any sort of Germanic peoples honoring Eostre in Britain, for example. That was all calculated and set back in the 300s. So there's just a semantic connection, if anything, that Easter fell in the months of eostre month, and that month was named after a goddess. That's it.
Well, you know what's interesting about that is when I heard that claim just recently, because apparently my TikTok is stupid. I started looking into this eostre because when I tweeted that you were coming on, someone was like, "Oh, well, obviously that's true. You've heard of I'm just going to say eostre because that's how it looks." But I actually looked into it. The mention of this goddess called Eostre, there's only one mention of her in any writing, which is by Bede. And there are 2 months that he spoke about in that writing that he claimed were named after gods, which is a funny thing because apparently the way the Germanic peoples talked of their months, the days were named after gods: Wednesday, Woden's Day, Odin's Day, Thursday, Thor's Day, etc. But months were all named after, like one of them was named after a wheel because it was when you turned over from one season into the other. I'm guessing winter into spring or something like that. But they're all maybe not that one because that would probably be the Easter month. But what's funny is there are no mentions of these two gods that he claimed were the semantic origins of this anywhere else. And so even that is a very tenuous maybe that this goddess ever even existed.
Yes, some historians ask that maybe she didn't exist and Bede was just coming up with an explanation. However, recently there was a scholar named Philip A. Shaw that made a case that many places in Britain in place names probably descend from Eostre, like Easterling, for example. And so he made a case that there probably was some goddess. But here's the caveats. Okay, we have no idea what her role was or how vast her worship was. We don't have any evidence she was a fertility goddess or a dawn goddess, or what day her festivals or feasts fell. We don't know much. Philip A. Shaw even suggested maybe Eostre comes from this idea that there was these people on the eastern side of Britain that worshipped her, not this idea that she was a goddess of the dawn and associated with the sun rising in the east, because it's all speculative. All we have is just one reference from Bede, and very little is really known about her. Yeah, but prior to Shaw, a lot of historians have doubted her even existence.
Yeah, well, so I mean, and it's so up in the air. So when the show and book American Gods make her a super powerful god because people worship her every year, or someone on Twitter says, hey, obviously it's pagan because of this particular goddess, you're like, we don't even know if that was a goddess that existed. Like, we can't say that with any certainty.
Yeah,
much less.
Absolutely. We don't have any like actual inscriptions mentioning her anywhere. That'd be interesting to find. But all these stories about her, like creating a rabbit, egg-laying rabbit, for example, they come from folklorists in the 19th century. They were just making things up to explain where Easter traditions may have come from. So they literally invented this entire mythology around Eostre, which, again, not based in reality at all. It was all invented 100 years ago. Yet people quote stories about her as if it's historical.
Right. Well, and that was the when I was doing the episode with you, and we did another one on Krampus. Then the research that I found, I actually found out that Krampus proper, not maybe what he may have been based on previously, but Krampus was an invention by socialist folklorists to make Christmas seem pagan in Germany. It was around the time of Adolf Hitler. Apparently, this was a thing.
Well, I think that's when they started claiming it was pagan. But we do have we do have Christmas cards in Germany from the 1800s that have Krampus on it, and I think most historians believe it's just the devil. Krampus is just a devil figure that comes from like the medieval devil plays.
Right. No, I'm just saying they named him and made him a part of it within their folklore at that point to prove that it was pagan. Like they just gave him a proper title and stuff like that, which is just fascinating to me. One of the 1 second, Matching Bird asks, is April Fool's pagan? Of course it is. Okay, so
no, it's not, but yeah.
So are you just kidding? Or I mean, who knows?
Yeah, I'm kidding. Well, okay, so speaking of the name, in my opinion, silliest thing I see is this meme that goes around. That's a relief carving of a goddess who is probably Ishtar, the Babylonian goddess who was previously Inanna. That's the connection there. Or it's her sister Erushkigal. And on this thing, what it says is that the name Easter comes from the name Ishtar, which would technically be pronounced like correctly Ishtar, but they say, oh, you say it exactly the same way. Her name is Easter. That's how you say Ishtar. It's Easter, and that's where it got its name. And she is, of course, a fertility goddess, and thus that's what this is all about. Again, more fertility rites in the ancient Sumerian culture. I think this is a big Hislop thing.
Yes, this all comes from Alexander Hislop, this anti-Catholic Scottish preacher living in the 1800s. And Ishtar was never pronounced Easter. That's nonsense. She was never associated with rabbits or eggs. Fertility was sort of like one of her tasks, but she was also a goddess of war. That was more of her main task.
It was, so her, from what I understand, it was even less than fertility. It was sex in war rather than fertility in war.
Yeah, for sure. But she is associated kind of more with like the cycle of the crop. So there's a text, an Akkadian text called Ishtar's Descent, where she goes into the underworld, and when she's down there, they're complaining because, you know, the livestock won't breed, the crops won't grow. She needs to come back up so that can actually happen.
Right. And was it her sister that ended up living with the underworld god Erushkigal?
I can't remember exactly, but in Inanna's Descent, which is her Sumerian name, she comes back up. And I believe, yeah, it's her sister and her husband, Tammuz, that have to take turns in the underworld every year.
Right. What's really interesting about that, though, is at one point there was a story about Ishtar or Inanna, I can't remember which, where she had to choose between a farmer and a and a hunter, or a shepherd, a farmer and a shepherd, and as her husband, and Tammuz was the shepherd, or no, was the farmer. And so what was really interesting about that, it reminds me of the Cain and Abel story, where God chose Abel's sacrifice rather than Cain's, where Inanna chose the shepherd over the chose the farmer over the shepherd.
Well, I think I can't remember exactly because it's a very fragmented text. But Tammuz is like the shepherd god, like that's his role. He sort of gets put on sort of like a pedestal as like a god later.
Yeah. Well, I may have gotten the two mixed up, but it's just really interesting that it has that same sort of choosing between the farmer and the shepherd as we have in the Cain and Abel story. Because Genesis is such a fascinating book with polemics that you don't necessarily see unless you actually study Sumerian religion and stuff. You start to see some kind of interesting rejections of Sumerian mythology in there, and I find that fascinating. Is there anything else that Hislop brought to the table?
Well, Hislop wrote The Two Babylons and basically argued that the Catholic Church is secretly not Christian. They're worshiping Nimrod and his wife Semiramis, which he associates with Ishtar, and Ishtar is also Aphrodite, Astarte from Canaan, all this kind of stuff. And it's this secret, mystery religion that's really being promoted. And he makes up a lot of stuff in there that's just utter nonsense. And as we mentioned earlier, like about 10 years ago, Jim Staley put out his documentary, Truth or Tradition, where he basically just recycled a lot of Hislop's old arguments about Semiramis creating like these egg-laying rabbits. And they talk about, I believe Hislop talks about how babies were sort of sacrificed, and that's why we dye eggs red, because it represents the blood. But Hislop is just making this stuff up. He's got no evidence for it. We have no evidence Nimrod was ever a god in ancient Mesopotamia. He's mentioned in Genesis. That's it. I think Chronicles as well. And then later Christian and Jewish texts, but he doesn't show up in any ancient Mesopotamian works. During the days of Abraham, the head deity in Babylon would have been Enlil. And then during the Neo-Babylonian period, he's replaced by Marduk. So there's never a deity called Nimrod. And, I would say, Nimrod is probably either like Hammurabi or Sargon of Akkad. We're not entirely sure. But if there was this historical Nimrod, which I tend to think there was, he would have been separated by the historical Semiramis by over like 1,000 years or more or less. So this idea that there was ever this couple in Mesopotamia is just nonsense made up by Hislop. But people repeat this stuff today because they don't know any better, and they've not done actual research.
Well, that's what's so interesting to me is I've had a lot of conversations with people lately who are saying things that you cannot possibly credibly assert. You know what I mean? Like the eostre or Easter, or the like Semiramis being a goddess. I don't even think that's quite. I don't think she was ever considered a goddess, just a queen. Like I'm not 100% sure because I don't read ancient Sumerian, but
she's probably an amalgamation of a couple different queens. Generally, she's like this Assyrian queen that sort of restores the city of Babylon. That's like her role. Is that she's originally like a wife of a governor, and then this is all coming from Diodorus, for example. Then she sort of becomes the queen of Assyria. After he dies, she becomes this famous warrior type queen that eventually restores the city of Babylon. And that's the mythology around her. Most likely, she's an amalgamation of different queens in that region.
Yeah, but never a goddess, from what I know, from what I've looked into. So it's a weird assertion, but that like I said, there's a lot of people that are making these huge assertions that are not backed by anything, and I just can't understand someone, because maybe it's just because of who I am as a person, but if I'm going to claim something, I have to have some knowledge and backing as to why I'm claiming it. Like, just trust me, bro, is not good enough for me. Because I don't want to look like an idiot.
Yeah, you'd think that would be, but I mean, that's what a lot of people do is they cite something like this common knowledge. For example, people will say, everyone knows you only use 10% of your brain. Why? Well, Hollywood has done movies showing us this. So people just think that's true, because why would you make a movie that's millions of dollars and basically based on often is like an actual myth? Well, because it makes money. There's no evidence. We use 100% of our brains, for example. To say we only use 10% of our brains is absurd. So there's that, for example. But that just becomes common knowledge. People just assume that that's the way it is. Same with the origin of like Easter and Christmas. Everyone just keeps being told over and over again it's pagan. So why would I hear from multiple sources it's pagan and they all be wrong? Well, sometimes that's just how myths work. They just get circulated so much and people just start quoting each other. And then but no one ever considered talking to an actual historian about it.
Yeah, well, I think that's probably one of the most healthy things you can do. Is it's hard to do because they're unknown unknowns. They're things that you can't possibly know that you've got wrong until someone tells you. But it is very healthy to take a look at your belief system, the things that you claim, the things that you say, and go, hey, let me actually check out what I'm saying before I say it to everyone on the planet and act like this is truth. It's just, I mean, I get it that we don't know what we don't know, but there are times I'm talking to these people, and I told you about a certain instance of this earlier, Mike, which I won't go into because I don't want to offend anyone who may listen to this, but a conversation I was having where someone made this assertion contrary to like the known fact. And I was just like, I don't think I can talk to you anymore. Like this is very basic knowledge that you can everyone knows. And it's not because, oh, well, there's this myth that people have repeated. We have the source material here. Why are you arguing against that? And so it's a wild world we live in. But I like Easter, so I wanted to make sure anyone who likes Easter and had a Torah observant or some random person on the internet tell them that they can't enjoy Easter and celebrate the resurrection of Jesus Christ because they'll go to hell in some way. That's nonsense, and you can celebrate Easter. For God's sake, you can celebrate Easter.
Yeah, there's no religious reason to deny the celebration of Easter.
I think, Mike, something I've heard you say elsewhere, you've spoken to it a little bit tonight, but I've heard you say it, like I know you brought it up on Cultish recently. I listened to that interview and I've heard you say it before, but it basically ends up being agenda driven, right? I mean, people are saying these things for a purpose. They're not, this would be like going to scripture and practicing, eisegesis at its finest. It's like, no, I have a point that I'm trying to make and I'm going to do my best to make it. And I'm not really seeking where the evidence is actually going to take me.
Yeah, it's a lot of it. It is agenda driven, and that people in like the Torah observant movement want to scare people. If they can scare them, then they can get them under their umbrella or under their wing and get them to do the things they want and be part of their group. So what they do is they use these scare tactics like Easter is pagan, stay away from it. God hates everything that's pagan. We've got much better alternatives. Come here. And so if you want to convince people to be a Torah observant of Christian, I mean, fine, best of luck to you. But don't use scare tactics. Don't use misinformation. Don't try to use these blatant lies to try to just get people to be all afraid of simple customs like hiding Easter eggs. It's absurd.
It is. Are there any other Easter myths that we've missed? Because there are definitely fewer than Christmas because they hate Christmas way more than they hate Easter. But are there any weird things that you would hear people claim that you know of that we could bust?
Not around Easter I can really think of. Some people will say like, the origin of it is pagan because it's not on the day, Jesus rose from the dead. Jesus rose from the dead, on one specific historical day. He doesn't rise different every year because Easter falls on the first Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox. Okay, why is that? Well, the history is because in the early days of Christianity, they just would follow the Jewish calendar. So whenever Passover was coming around, they'd celebrate Easter on that Sunday. And that's generally what happened. Well, in the 300s, this is where the Council of Nicaea actually comes in. They decided that they're going to start doing it this way. They'll do it, after the spring equinox. And so that there were a couple different calculations of that. But eventually St. Bede sort of sets this down in his book, The Reckoning of Time. This idea that it's going to be on the first Sunday after the first full moon of the spring equinox. And then his book was widely copied and spread around, and that just sort of became the standard. And so it just comes from the fact that Jews were calculating a solar lunar calendar. So Passover is a different day every year. And Christians just sort of inherited that idea of following the courses of the moon. And although it was modified over time, that's where it comes from. It didn't come from any sort of pagan idea.
Well, that was one of the, I feel like when I did watch that Jim Staley documentary, and he made some tenuous claims about, worshiping on Sunday because the Catholics are worshiping the sun god, and all of that, which is tied in, but I don't know if it's super apropos. But do you remember those claims?
Yeah, because he made them recently in a documentary I responded to, and then
he made the new documentary?
Yeah, well, he made a new one called December 25th on Trial, and the same day. And so here's the story behind that. He posted it on March 25th, and a Catholic friend and I watched it, and we were like, this is just so bad. We could debunk it now. And we just decided to go live the same day because it was just that bad. Like, it's really bad when we're both seeing the same errors, and it's like, we could debunk this really easily. So we did. To his credit, to Jim's credit, he took it down a few days later, but then he said, there's only minor errors I need to correct in it. Nonsense. His entire documentary is based on numerous blunders, major errors. So it'll be interesting to see if he ever re-uploads it. But he made the same claim there. He said the idea that Sunday worship comes from paganism. He actually used the phrase comes from the pagan Sabbath. There is no such thing as a pagan Sabbath. That's just not a thing. Again, Christians were worshiping on Sunday probably in the 1st century. We see it in the Didache, for example, about Christians meeting on the Lord's Day. Then we see it in Justin Martyr's work. We see it in Origen. We see it in Tertullian. Ironically, Tertullian was one of Jim's sources, but he didn't quote the fact that Tertullian also says that Christians worshipped on Sunday. Really a lot of cherry picking going on. But yeah, he claimed that, under Constantine, they made it official. The Sabbath is now Sunday. Okay, yeah, Constantine did make that kind of an official thing, like the day of rest is going to be Sunday. But again, it's because Christians, that was a long-standing tradition of Christians that goes back to the 1st century. It wasn't just made up then and there. Christians were not keeping the Sabbath for generations at that point, going back to the letters of Ignatius telling Christians, you don't have to keep the Sabbath. And then his letters were endorsed by Polycarp. So, I mean, I don't know what to tell these guys. They're just really bad at getting these historical facts, or they just quote mine them, unfortunately. And I really hope they're just bad at it, because I don't want to accuse them of, being deceitful.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's what's so funny is, I had a girl on, oh gosh, it has to have been a year and a half, 2 years ago. And we talked about the idea of the Sabbath, and, she talked about how it should be on Saturday and all of that. And I tried to explain that, I know that you want to believe that we changed that Christians and Constantine or Charlemagne or whoever you want to make the boogeyman changed the Sabbath to Sunday, but that's never actually what happened. I mean, you can look in Revelation, at the beginning of Revelation, when it talks about John having his vision, and he was in the Spirit on the Lord's Day. I mean, it's even attested to in the Bible that there was something called the Lord's Day that was, otherwise they would have called it the Sabbath. I mean, that wasn't, from my understanding, a common parlance for the name or the word Sabbath. They would have said Sabbath.
Exactly. And, it's just one of those things that, again, the reason why Christians wanted to worship on Sunday is simple. Jesus rose from the dead on that day. So it became the Christian sacred day kind of thing. So, that's just generally what happened.
But that claim that you said that they make that, Jesus only rose once, I laughed because I know they also don't celebrate birthdays, but it's like, do they think people are celebrating birthdays because people are born every year on the same day? Like, what a weird thing to say.
Yeah, well, they'll claim birthdays are pagan as well, because, and they'll use this really bad argument. They'll say that, like, the only time birthdays come up in the Bible is when bad people are doing it. So Pharaoh has a birthday celebration. Herod Antipas has a birthday celebration. And they'll be like, see, only bad people do it. Well, that's just guilt by association. The reason why we don't see birthday celebrations in the Bible is because people didn't know when they were born. They didn't have modern calendars, modern timekeeping methods. People would have known, yeah, you were born around Yom Kippur. That kind of thing. You're born a couple of weeks before that. That's generally what they would know. They didn't know the exact day like we do today. But the Bible never condemns birthday celebrations.
Yeah, I find that to be it's just bizarre to me, because at the end of the day, when you're talking to these people and they're telling you not to celebrate Easter at all, that you should celebrate Passover, that this idea that you shouldn't be directly and openly and explicitly celebrating the resurrection of Christ is so weird to me. Like, I know you can tie it into Passover, by all means you can, but this is a special day a special event that we celebrate every year. And how could you ever say there's something wrong with that?
Yeah, they'll say things like, well, they'll tie it into Passover. If you're a Torah observant Christian, they'll celebrate it as part of the Passover celebration. Fine, good for you. Don't condemn us for doing it the way the church has done it for 2,000 years. You can do it the way you want. We know, for example, I believe it was Polycarp that was celebrating it on the Passover, the resurrection. He was keeping the Passover. There was this whole controversy in the 2nd century where there was the Christians in Rome were saying, no, you can't keep it like this. And then they pushed back from the East and that kind of thing. And, eventually the Roman Christians won out. But I mean, there's nothing wrong if you want to keep the Passover, but don't then turn around and condemn Christians for not and keeping Easter.
Right. Well, it's like Cody here says.
Oh, go ahead.
It's just the same thing. Cody's here talking about there's some interesting primary source data which suggests that many Christians observe the Sabbath and Lord's Day for some time until Sabbath was abandoned. Jewish Christians, for sure.
And I think Justin Martyr mentions some of them as well, like these Jewish Christians. And I know Rodney Stark, this historian, will talk about that over time, there were actually many Jews that became Christians, but over time they just sort of blended with the Gentiles and just became Christians because they didn't think they had to keep the same Torah observant rituals. We know from Paul's letter, there were Jewish Christians in Rome, for example. And we also know that by the 2nd century, Rome was basically the center place for mainstream Christianity after the Jewish wars. And many of them were very much this idea, no, you don't have to keep anything Jewish. It's, we are under the new covenant now. This has all been fulfilled in Christ. So what happened to the Jewish Christians in there? Well, they just became Christians. I mean, they didn't really think they had to keep their same Jewish heritage anymore because they were now Jewish. Now, if there's a Jewish Christian who wants to keep the Torah, fine. There's nothing wrong with that.
Was it Galatians that says, kind of stay where you are? Like if you come to the faith as a Jew and you keep Torah, keep Torah. If you come to the faith as not Christian, as Gentile, you don't have to get circumcised. You don't have to do Passover. Like, you can just stay as you are.
Yeah, it's big in Galatians, and some of the Torah observant interpretations of Galatians. It's just like some of the most ad hoc things I've ever heard in my entire life. But it's also pretty clear in 1 Corinthians 7, where Paul's like, if you're of the uncircumcised, you're fine. If you're of the circumcised, you're fine. You don't have to become one or the other, kind of thing. So, it's pretty clear that Paul was A-okay with people not keeping the Torah. It wasn't necessary. And so you get a lot of these Torah observant Christians like just having to reinterpret Paul in these very convoluted ways. And it's just like, sad, I guess.
Well, they have to, I guess, to keep the whole Bible and be whole Bible believers. But you were going to say something, Naomi. I don't want to run you over and forget about you.
Oh, you're good. Yeah, I just wanted to jump in and add, I mean, we have so much in Scripture that points to the importance of remember, have these rhythms to our day, to our week, to our seasons, and remember what God has done for us. And so why would we not apply that to the death and resurrection of our Savior? However we're going to come to those dates, however we're going to do it, I think we have so much in the Torah that would point to that's good. Now, I'm not saying it like we have to do it, but to condemn it makes no sense at all.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and not to mention, a lot of times the people that I've talked to who are kind of Torah observant, I think that they probably come from certain Christian sects that don't do very much when it comes to the church calendar. There's an entire church calendar that Christians function off of. Liturgy, different times of the year. I mean, we have Lent, we have all of these different enunciate. Well, that's Catholic. Not everyone does that, but different parts of the year that Christians have that it's not that much different than doing the different, celebrations in Judaism. but it's Christian rather than Jewish. So, I mean, if you want those things, you just go to an Anglican church, go to a Catholic church, go to one of the churches that really focuses on the common church calendar. Celebrate it there. You don't have to go and try to find your way back to Judaism to do it.
Yeah, exactly.
But so we're at about 55 minutes. So I'm going to start shifting over to the extended episode where I'm probably going to ask you questions about how annoying your TikTok is, your TikTok feed is, and stuff like that. But before we do that, I did want to let everyone know where to find you. I have, unfortunately, when I made my list, I only put Mike's stuff on it, so I'm not going to read it off for both of you this time. You're going to have to do it yourself. So, Naomi, if people want to find you, let's do that first.
Yeah, easiest is just to go to beemboldened.com, beemboldened.com, and from there you can get to anything else. So that's where I'd start.
So easy, so simple. And how about you, Mike?
Yeah, you can find me on YouTube, Inspiring Philosophy. I'm on TikTok under the same name, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all the same name, just Inspiring Philosophy.
You also have a website, inspiringphilosophy.org, if I remember correctly.
Correct, yes.
I'm so smart. But beyond that, I do want to ask, I'll ask you both, since this is both your second time coming on my show in some instance. I'm going to ask you the big question again. And I'll start with Naomi, then we'll end with Mike. But what is something right now it could be in your life, global, local, in the house, wherever, what's something that gives you the hope and motivation to carry on doing what you do and to live a life that's not complete drudgery? What gives you hope?
I mean, I could give the obvious answer. It seems touche in a way, but I'm like, yeah, I mean, my hope truly, legitimately is eternity with Christ. And I mean that. I mean, coming from a life like mine, that is what has kept me alive, is my relationship with him. So, and in the day to day, it's seeing him move in the lives of others and give them the same freedom that he's given me. It's incredibly motivating. In some ways, it's like I live every day and work every day in the past trauma that I have experienced, but I get to see him show up and do stuff that I could never do in people's lives. And it's so encouraging and so inspiring and keeps me wanting to do it. So as long as I get to be here and do it, I'm going to do it.
Can I just say, that is probably one of my favorite things about you, is because I did have a guy who was once in a Mormon polygamous cult come on the show. But one thing that I found is the enemy loves a Christianity based cult, because I have yet to be able to find one Mormon who has left Mormonism that hasn't become atheist or something else, anything but Christian. And so there's this particular deceptive quality within the cults that throws the baby out with the bathwater. And so the fact that you are still Christian and are stronger in your Christianity and your walk with God than you were in the cult, and you didn't just abandon it all, impresses the heck out of me. And I'd love to find at least one person who was Mormon and then became Christian. That's all I want to find.
There's been some.
If I find one, I'll introduce you.
I know
Please
one.
do.
There's a woman on Twitter named Kay, K-A-Y, who ex-Mormon. She's now Catholic. There was a guy called Bishop Earl who was a Mormon bishop and became a Christian as well. So I've seen a couple.
Oh, well, I'm going to have to search for them on Twitter and see if I can find them, because I want to have that conversation. But like I said, it's such a unique deception to use Christianity to make a cult, because it runs people away from Jesus completely in a way that other cults do not. They don't have that power. But
it's so confusing.
To get off that sour note, Mike, what gives you hope? Same question, but this time with beard.
Yeah, it's hope that I can help someone through my channel. I mean, when I started the channel, my idea was if I can just help one person come to Christ, that'll be worth it all. And so, luckily, I've well exceeded that expectations by the grace of God, and that's what just keeps me going to keep seeing more of that.
Oh yeah, well, and that's what's funny is my show started out in kind of a dumb political way, and then we changed over time and we became more Christian content, more talking about Jesus, theology, things like that. And the fact that I know of anyone who has rededicated their life to the Lord based off of my dumb mouth, incredible. God can make the rocks speak if he wants to, and I'm one of them. And I'm happy to be there. But let's go ahead and shift over into the extended episode where we can have more fun. All of you who have listened and watched, thanks for coming on, Mike, so that everyone knows I said it and they don't just hear it at the end. Thank you for coming on. Thank you for co-hosting with me, Naomi. But the rest of you, next week, we're going to be talking to my friends PJ and Abby from Conspiracy Pilled, who started kind of like my story, started a podcast based off of conspiracies, and it has now just become a ministry instead. And so we're going to talk to them next week. I want to get the details because he put it in that way, and I was like, either you're playing it just for me, or we're very similar people. So I'm excited about that. Beyond that, you can find me on Twitter at @HamCarlos. That's where you can see all of the presidents' whatever I think of. I have them all in orange jumpsuits as well. That was not my biggest hit, but I enjoyed it. You could also join the patreon.com/themadOnes, t-shirts, mugs, posters. I did do my favorite painting is one of Van Gogh's early paintings it's a skeleton smoking a cigarette. It's not the cleanest, most Christian painting I've ever seen, but it's my favorite one. Something about it I love. It evokes something in me. But since it's royalty free, I did make a vector of it, and I made a very high quality print. And so if you want one of those, you can go to wearethemadOnes.com/store, get that, a shirt, whatever. If you're listening, you can watch it weekly, typically, not today, but typically at 8:30 p.m. Eastern time on Thursdays at youtube.com/themadOnes. We're also on Rockfin and Rumble. So if you want to see my face, don't know why you would. If you want to see my face, that's where you can do it. If you're watching and you're like, oh God, that beard looks terrible, you can go to wearethemadOnes.com and listen to it there, or any podcatcher that you like to use. So that's all. We're going to move into last call now. As always, you have a chance to be a light in the world. So go light it up.